I don't come from a musical family. I mean, there are some musicians back a couple of generations, but my parents were kind of tone deaf, and my sister took piano for a couple of years, but kind of lost interest very quickly. But I was very interested in music from an early age. I started studying piano when I was 5 years old. I took up saxophone when I was 9. I was composing music probably when I was 11 or 12. And I was starting to make music with computers by the time I was 12 years old. So I developed these interests very early in my life. And I think that for me, it always seemed that I had a lot of different passions, and it seemed that music was one of my strongest passions, but it was always something that I was going to do as a hobby and kind of do on the side. I don't think anyone ever told me that, but that was just kind of what I assumed and what made sense to me. And I got to college and started my college career as a math major. That didn't last very long, but I very quickly settled into computer science, and that was really what I wanted to do. And but I was taking a lot of music classes. I was studying composition as well and spending a lot of my time. And so I was composing a lot. So eventually I said, okay, well, I'll do a double major. And so, the music is still kind of the fun part of it, but it's something I really feel strongly about doing while I'm in college. So I started on this path for a double major, and then I spent a summer after my sophomore year of college. I was an intern at Microsoft. This was 1997, and Microsoft was at that point, the coolest place for a computer science major to get an internship in, where everyone wanted to go working after they graduated, and it was a really boring summer. I think there's no better way to put it than that. I felt like the problems I was working on, the things I was doing just weren't interesting to me at all. And I thought that, I kind of saw this life laid out in front of me of going to work in industry at a company like Microsoft. And I wasn't excited by that. And so, I came back to Yale my junior year, and I looked at all the computer science courses in front of me, and they all looked pretty boring too, I've got to say. Like the complexity of algorithms and stuff like that. And so I'd taken all the core courses in the major already for computer science, and there are all these music courses I really wanted to take. I dropped the computer science major. I continued as a music major, figuring, well, it doesn't really matter what I do, because this was the height of the .com boom. Figured I could get a job regardless of what my major was. I could still go, work at a startup or work in industry afterwards. And I got to my last year of college. I applied for a job at Microsoft, and I was on the verge of going out there for an interview. And I also applied to some top graduate schools in composition. And I figured, let me just kind of see what fate has in store for me. If I got into one of these top schools, I took that as a sign that I should kind of go in that direction. And I was lucky. I got into several of them. And I decided to go to Columbia in New York City for a variety of reasons. And I did my graduate studies there. And so I think, looking at what enabled me to go into composition, I think a lot of it was just this gradual realization that was an acceptable decision to make in terms of a career. And obviously that came as a result of a lot of encouragement from professors, from colleagues, from my family too, over the years, that led me to that realization. It's also funny, I think, that at every stage I've been fairly naive, and I've thought that, like at that stage in my senior year of college, I thought, well, if I get into one of these great graduate schools, then my career is set, which is obviously not true. Or, when I was in graduate school, I figured, well, if I won one of these big competitions, for composers, then my career would be set. That happened, and it's also not true. There's a continual set of kind of milestones that have to achieve to kind of maintain success and stature in the field. And at this point, I've been at Georgia Tech for 10 years. I'm a tenured professor. I think I have a lot more security in my career than I have at any other point, for sure. But still, at least in my life as a composer, I think it's very, it's always fragile. It's always dependent on maintaining connections and having others continue to value my work in a way that they want to commission and support it and perform it. But chance is also something that's very embedded in my artistic practice, and I think chance not so much in a Cagean sense of trying to take control out of the experience as much as possible, but chance in the sense of giving up my own control as a composer and putting that control into often to other people's hands. So sharing my process of creating music with other people and inviting them to collaborate with me to influence how the music transpires in performance. And then accepting whatever comes, which is often wonderful, is sometimes horrible. But it's that process of collaboration and that uncertainty and the risk that results in it that's really interesting to me, because I feel like a lot of music these days is about trying to take out risk from performance. Like the fact that most of what we listen to these days is recorded in the studio rather than performed live. So there's this opportunity to sit back and edit and perfect or do as many takes as you want until it's just the way you want it. Or even in performance, there's maybe less so in classical music than in other genres, but there's this desire to kind of recreate what has been done in the studio and recording live, which often ends up resulting in music that is not as live as you might think. I mean, there's extreme cases where people are lip syncing, or the entire Atlanta Symphony Orchestra is asked to mime performing at a performance. But even outside of those extreme cases, a lot of what we actually hear in live performance is in fact pre-recorded, or at least choreographed to such a degree that it's largely indistinguishable from one performance to the next. And then if we look at the realm of electronic music, where I do a lot of my work, we're looking at this legacy of decades of tape music, of fixed medium music, where the performers didn't exist at all in many of these works. It's just work the composer commits straight to tape or CD or MP3 or whatever the modern equivalent is. And I think our field is really just in the last 10 or 15 or 20 years starting to broaden from that and accept that there's a broader world of electronic music beyond that, where performance is really a critical part of it. Yeah, so the boxes that Sonic Generator performed with last week, the whole trajectory of that piece is just wonderful to me, because it all started off with one of our master's students here at Georgia Tech who designed those boxes as a project for a class. And Jessica Sherwood, our flutist, was so entranced by them when she saw them that she took these boxes to her friend Mark Mellitz, a wonderful composer, and we ended up commissioning this piece from him to create with these boxes for Jessica. And the boxes, to me, the possibility of them really embody something that's also really important to my work, which is this notion of the open form. And this goes back to a very old idea from a number of composers in the 50s and 60s, Earl Brown, Halbenstock Ramadi, Stockhausen, and others that really had this notion that musical scores didn't need to be fixed things that went from start to finish, but they could be a set of musical material that could be recombined in performance in a variety of different ways. And that's essentially what the boxes enable to me, is that, by recombining these boxes in performance, you're essentially creating different sets of musical motives, and different orders to them. This open form is a really interesting a way to think about notation and scores and composition at the intersection of technology and collaboration. Because it enables me as a composer to be able to create, rather than a fixed piece that goes from start to finish, to be able to really think about creating an environment to be explored. And that might be explored by performers in concert. It might be explored by people on their mobile phones or on a website. It may be explored in a variety of different ways. But my job is no longer to create a single piece, but to create this set of possible pieces, or this space of possible pieces. And then each performance becomes very unique because it becomes a different traversal of that space. There's a great quote by Terry Riley, who's one of my favorite composers, who said, there were a couple related quotes, and I hope I get these right. One of them was to the effect of, I'm no good at telling people what to do. And the other one was that he was sitting down to write, and he got this kind of writer's block because he could imagine so many different possibilities about how to write this particular section of music. He couldn't justify why he should pick one over any of the others. And so that's one way of thinking about this motivation of open form, is kind of keeping all those possibilities open, and transferring the responsibility of making those decisions, and the privilege of making those decisions to other people. My first exposure to minimalism was when I was in high school. And there were a series of things that happened all over the course of a couple of years. I don't remember the order of them anymore, but one was I remember my saxophone teacher at the time had just bought this amazing album called Glassworks, and he was playing it all the time. He dubbed a copy for me on cassette tape, and I started listening to it all the time. I thought it was amazing as well. That was the first time I heard Glass's music. Right around the same time that I grew up in Miami, and there was an annual new music festival there. It actually still happens, called Subtropics. They bring in different composers each year, and the first year I heard about it, Steve Reich was the guest composer, and they did a big concert with the New World Symphony with a few of his pieces. And again, I was just really amazed by what I heard. And then I found some Steve Reich recordings and kind of went from there. And I also I didn't study composition regularly in high school, but every once in a while I was able to have a lesson or two with somebody here or there. And I had one of these lessons, and the person told me that I should listen to John Adams' music, and they specifically pointed me towards harmonium. So I heard that for the first time right around then as well. And that music was very influential on me. There were kind of two strands of influence I think I had early on my compositional career. One were the minimalists, and the other was this kind of other fringe of American experimental music. Because that same Subtropics festival also introduced me for the first time to John Cage, to Alvin Lucier, to Fluxus movement. I went to my first Fluxus concert when I was, I think, 16 years old, and they released chickens into the audience, and it was excellent. And and all of that music I kind of heard for the first time through that festival as well. And I didn't know what the Second Viennese School was. I didn't know any of the kind of tradition of 20th century contemporary music when I was in high school, really. But I knew a lot about these two strands of American experimental music, minimalism, and then this other strand. The sonic generator programming really comes about as a collaborative process with the members of the ensemble. Tom Sherwood and I and all the other musicians bring pieces forward that we're really interested in doing. And some of those are ones where composers have come to us, or we may have an opportunity to do a commission. And then we kind of look at what might form a good program. And our programming is also often influenced by external factors in terms of where we're performing and what makes sense thematically. So, our concert last week at Erickson Clock was very much a traditional sonic generator concert. We had a list of we were probably up to about 15 or 18 pieces that we were considering for that program. And then we narrowed it down on what we really felt would make sense to get a program. We knew that first piece on the program, the Daniel Wall, we really wanted to perform that because we'd We premiered it in Metz in February, but we never performed it in the U.S. In Atlanta. So we really wanted to share that with our audience here. And the rest of that, the program was really kind of in flux until we really settled on the Zorn, and because a number of musicians were really, we've done 2 or 3 pieces by Zorn in the past, and we've always really liked his music, and we really wanted to do something a little bit more substantial, do a pair of pieces on the program together. And then then we found some other things that we thought would fill out that program nicely. An example on the other end of the spectrum, back in the summer of 2012, we were invited to perform a concert as part of a big international conference that was happening in Atlanta called ICAD, the International Community for Auditory Display. And it's a conference where the leading researchers from around the world in the field of sonification come together to present papers about their work. Sonification is basically taking a data and turning it into sound. So you may do this because you want to help people with visual impairments to be able to understand the world around them or to understand data that they might not be able to see. But you might also do this because there are things that you can hear, particularly in terms of patterns and repetitions and time and things like that might not come through nearly as well in a visual representation. And so there was this whole conference around this, and we were asked to put together a concert program about this at the Academy of Medicine on West Peachtree. So, and we had the ability to invite a composer of our choice to come and feature on the concert. So, we ended up inviting this wonderful composer from Stanford, Jonathan Berger, who's been very involved in the sonification community over the years. We played a big string quartet of his. But then we really wanted to present a historical view of this field and also, bring some works that, by people that we didn't think that community would be familiar with, but spoke to this notion of turning something from outside of music into music. So we did this classic piece by a very early kind of pioneer of electronic music named Charles Dodge, which took some fractal data and used that in a piece for viola and electronic sound. And then we also did a piece by Steve Reich, actually. We did piano phase. We actually did a version for 2 marimbas, but we did that because we really didn't think of that as a piece that people wouldn't think of that as a sonification piece traditionally, but it is really taking this idea and realizing that idea and that process as music. And we thought from that perspective it really spoke to the theme of the conference. So that's something where our programming really arose from an external prompt, I would say. And that's our other extreme. Well, to say that about new music in general, I think is kind of ridiculous. I mean, listen to... There's plenty of music being written today that even the person that made that comment would not ascribe that comment to. Like George Rocker, for instance, it would be in my mind, a good example of that. But I think that a lot of us, if we listen to music that's unfamiliar, find it difficult to approach initially. I'm going through this battle right now with my 4-year-old son. He only wants to listen to the soundtrack to Frozen. That is all he wants to listen to day in and day out. And I have to really work with him to get him to agree to even allow any other music to be playing. And he'll often, after just a few seconds, say, I don't like it. But if he listens to something 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 times, it'll usually become something that he likes. And so I think that a lot of times reactions like that, thinking that music is soulless or it doesn't make sense or it sounds random or whatever, are really just a response to the surface without an investment of the time required to really delve into that music and understand what makes it tick for you personally, to try to make sense of it as a listener. But I also think that it's the responsibility of those of us that present contemporary music to try to help audiences to make that journey, especially at a concert where there's not necessarily an easy opportunity to hear a piece more than once. And so I think, like with Sonic Generator, we've tried a number of things over the years to do that. Some of that is simply just talking about the music before we perform it, so that there's something that that people might be able to more easily latch onto when they're listening to it. Some of it is sometimes a pairing music with video, either choosing music that was conceived with a visual element, or commissioning visual artists here in Atlanta to create new videos to go along with our performances. So there's some kind of visual score or reference point to help people kind of latch onto what's in there and ease them going in. And we also work with work across mediums a lot, not just the visual domain, but we work with Glow ATL a lot in our collaborations, and that's another way that I feel like we can bring people in where the music is being presented. It's never background to something else or subservient to something else, but when it's paired with something else, there's this opportunity for both media to inform the other, and to kind of help us delve deeply into that work. I don't think it's a binary thing here. I agree with you that music can accrue emotion through association, but I think that even the most abstract music in the world can inherently create, at least in me. I don't want to try to tell other people how they hear music, but for me it can be extremely emotional. There's this piece by Gerard Griset, one of the kind of founders of the spectral method of composition, and it's this evening length performance called the Spa Acoustique. It's the whole piece is based on this computer analysis of a low bass trombone, and how all the partials in it are kind of varying over time. Everything, the whole piece is kind of derived from that. So extremely abstract notion, very abstract music. It starts with a solo viola piece, and gradually over the evening it builds up to a whole orchestra. But about 40 minutes into the piece, it moves up from 8 musicians to about 18 musicians. For the first time, you have the bass trombone in the ensemble, you have a double bass in the ensemble. So when all these instruments come in, they come in with that low, I think it's a low E. This whole analysis is based on kind of the whole bass of that all these microtones have been based on. Suddenly comes in, and so all of a sudden, all these seemingly dissonant harmonies have been happening this whole time, have this foundation to them that explains them and justifies them. And I mean, I get chills every time I hear that, because of how this has been set up and kind of the logic behind it. It's a very emotional moment, I think, in the piece, but extremely abstract. Like 5/1 cadence isn't usually going to do that to me because I've heard it so much, and if it's just kind of something that I expect, that's not going to provoke that same emotional reaction in me. But if it's something that's especially these moments where there's something that I can't understand as a listener, and then slowly, gradually, somehow that's that context, it finds its sonic home, and kind of is all of a sudden makes sense. That resolution to me is extremely emotional. I think this is all making a very good point, and I'll phrase it in a slightly different way. There's actually, so every couple of years here I teach a course in the history of electronic music that all of our graduate students are required to take. And to me, I think one of the most interesting readings that I sign in that whole course, I make them listen to this piece by Hildegard Westerkamp, who's a Canadian composer from the soundscape composition and acoustic ecology, and then I have them read this article by Andrew McCartney. It's an analysis of that piece, and the piece is called Cricket Voice, and it's all, she went to the New Mexico desert and sampled all these sounds of crickets and their environment, and made this very beautiful piece in kind of a classic soundscape composition sense, trying to take us to this beautiful space, and maybe in doing so kind of raise our ecological awareness of the soundscape and our need to protect it, and so on and so forth. So McCartney, in her article, played this piece for a bunch of her students and asked them to write, kind of a story behind her, what their reactions were. And the overwhelming majority of these students wrote stories about alien abduction, with strong references either to the X-Files or to the Alien trilogy movies. And so she was kind of delving into this and trying to understand why. But what's the important takeaway for me from that is that, no matter what you as a composer are trying to get across in a piece of music, however specific that might seem to you, you're going out and you're recording sounds of crickets for crying out loud, and you're organizing them into this piece. It seems like a pretty simple and obvious thing to do here, that would be difficult to be misconstrued. And yet, people bring their own experiences, their own perspectives, their own associations to listening to that piece. And you have no control over how people are going to interpret it or experience it. And that's something that I think is a very postmodern idea, but I think it's a very important one that composers often forget about. I think a lot of composers I know have this implicit idea that there's a right way to hear their music. Maybe this is embedded in this old 1950s, 1960s notion that music is intended just for this narrow audience of academicians and isn't really being written for a broader public, at least kind of in academic art music composition. Maybe we're still living some of that legacy a little bit, but I think it's really important. Whatever goes into a piece that's meaningful to me, and I may try to communicate some of that to my listener through program notes or whatever else. But when I kind of let that piece go, I have to value however people experience it and however they engage with it. Every piece is a little different, but these days it usually starts with a kind of broad concept for me. A lot of what I'm interested in as a composer is this kind of meta level of composition about, what is the context in which the work is being experienced, and who are the people that are experiencing and contributing to it. So I can walk through an example like this. This commission I just finished last week for turbulence.org. That lullaby, the toy piano piece was related to. It's part of a series of works I've been doing over a decade now that are really kind of reflections on how we listen to music in the world today and how technology changes that and how technology might be enabling new kinds of practices that we may not be considering because we're just transplanting our old ways into new technologies. And so this particular one is really about cloud listening. I use Spotify these days. That's where I listen to almost all my music. I have probably 1,000 CDs at home, but I can't remember the last time I actually physically got one out. I listen on my phone, I listen wherever I'm going. The music I'm listening to is streaming from the cloud, which is wonderful. I have 20 million songs with me wherever I go. But the question I asked was, why every time I listen to one of these pieces, I'm listening to the exact same zeros and ones, the exact same bits of audio. Why can't we think about a world in which I can create an album, but that album actually is not fixed anymore. It changes over time. Because people are streaming it, so why can't it change every time it's streamed? And so that's what this album was. There's 4 tracks on it, and it can only be streamed. You can't download it. And each of the pieces has these slow trajectories over 20, 30, 50 years, where they're changing very gradually over time. So you listen tomorrow or even next week, it'll probably sound very similar to what you're hearing right now. If you come back in a month or 6 months or a year, it'll start to sound very different. And so the idea here is that the album is called Grow Old, and it's really about kind of this notion of music growing with us. That we bring new associations and perspectives. Why can't the music also kind of evolve as we're evolving? So that we listen to fresh music with fresh ears. Music is being generated on the server at turbulence.org, and then it's being stored and archived on archive.org, which is just a big nonprofit that archives open source and Creative Commons media, and tries to archive the internet in general. And so I really actually wanted it to be on these services like Spotify and RDU and all these other streaming services, but they're not set up for something like this. If you want to replace a track, you've already published on one of these services, you have to make a phone call, and wait several months to get it updated, because that's such an unusual thing for anyone to want to do. And I even looked at places like YouTube and SoundCloud and all of these things that are supposed to make it very easy for people to share their music. And same restrictions there. In fact, all of them pretty much. Once you upload something, you can't change it at all. I think the reason for that is they're afraid someone's going to get a top hit on YouTube, let's say, and then auction off the rights to that space to an advertiser. So once you upload the content, you can't upload new audio or video to go with it. So I ended up. It turned out that archive.org not only kind of philosophically was in line with what I wanted. The whole piece is released under Creative Commons, but was also one of the few places that actually had a mechanism to support this. And then I ended up. It's published as podcast, so there's a way for you to subscribe to updates. So you don't have to keep going back to the website necessarily. You don't have to keep reloading the content that way. It'll automatically come to you through whatever podcast solution you prefer. I'd been thinking about this for probably a year before I actually sat down to write the individual pieces. The program is generating the music from scratch. So there's 4 tracks, I wrote 4 little software programs. And every night on the server, those software programs get run, and the output of those is a new audio file. This toy piano piece, it's essentially a crude simulation of my younger son playing the toy piano. And so it starts off, he's 17 months now, and so it starts off trying to, as if I put this piece that I composed, this lullaby, in front of him on the toy piano. What would happen today if he tried to sit down and play it? He was playing the toy piano this morning. It sounds pretty random. I put some things into the algorithm so it doesn't sound quite so random, because I want it to be musically compelling to me. But then, over the next 20 years, gradually, these mistakes or omissions or all these things gradually disappear until in 20 years it's playing the actual piece. And so that particular track on the album, that's the slow evolution. So every day it's changing these randomization parameters just a little bit, as he's getting older, and updating the audio accordingly.